Okay, hello, I am back, and today I'm going to read to you. I just took a walk, so my hair is not the greatest, so I'm wearing a hat. Plus, I need to do for a hair appointment soon. But I'm going to read to you from chapter 8 in the book about King George, and this is by Kenneth Rose. And we are on the second topic within chapter 8, which is entitled Family Circle. So I'm going to start reading, but I wanted to read to you this. If you can read through it. It is, they really had a good marriage. It's quite ridiculous, he says to her in May 1923. In 1923, it's quite ridiculous how much I miss you here. The house seems altogether different, and I was very lonely last night. This was an arranged marriage by his parents after his brother died because he was due to be the next king. So what's really interesting is he went ahead and married her, and they had a wonderful marriage. I mean, it was a good marriage between them. They had 5 children. Actually, they had 6 children. They had David, who became the Duke of Windsor. They had Albert, and then they had Princess Mary. Then they had Prince Henry, Prince George, and then John, being their youngest child, he had epilepsy. At the time, they didn't really know quite what to do with epilepsy, but he did die an early death, and they came across as uncaring and how they sheltered him away. But I think, in my opinion, I think they did care. And when you look at their marriage, now remember, he never, even though David was going to be the heir, they never had any prearranged marriages for any of their children. So that's something to bear in mind. But a lot of times in this marriage, Mary would often, acquiesce to King George's very conservative style, like those high collars. If she could have done without those, I think she could have. She didn't have painted fingernails because George was not a fan of them. So, anyways, you'll see. So I'll start reading. It's a very short chapter. Harold Lasky once described the role of the sovereign's private secretary as a dignified slavery. It is a phrase which, with equal justice, could be used of Queen Mary's domestic life. For more than 40 years, she was the indispensable guardian of her husband's comfort and peace of mind. She was a perpetual shield against irritation and anxiety. Some of her own personality, conforming to this every whim without resentment or even question. Although self-imposed, her servitude was absolute. It was revealed mostly against in the Queen's appearance, wearing what had already outmoded during the state visit to Paris in 1914. She had still not abandoned her long, full skirts, her toques, and parasols a decade later. Yeah, this was all a Victorian look, an Edwardian look and she continued to wear that fashion up until her death in 1953. So, a wide brim hat in the summer, a scarcely perceptible raising of a hem to show off her elegant ankles. But the king, as much of a wardrobe tyrant as his father, frowned upon the changes. She relapsed into a style of timeless dignity. None could claim that it was unbecoming. Returning to London in 1924 after an absence of 10 years, Mensdorf wrote, "She looks so much more beautiful, with the white hair of an older woman, yet a youthful freshness of complexion. She has put on no weight and is today more attractive than she has ever been." The Queen scorned the use of paint and disapproved of it in others. A young duchess who had been instructed to kiss her hand at a ball, in her ardor, she left a perfect print of a scarlet mouth on the back of a royal kid glove. "She gave me one withering look that said it all," wrote the culprit, "and I slunk away in disgrace." Apparel that on others might have seemed bizarre on her served only to rebuke the restless art of the courtier. For luncheon, it might be a very large fur collar dyed purple and a toque made entirely of artificial pansies. At a garden party, she bore down upon Mr. Shannon like the Jungfrau, white and sparkling in the sun. Lady Pamela Barry, dazzled by the nocturnal display of jewels that included 5 diamond necklaces. She has bagged all the best. As a matter of dress, so in planning family holidays, the Queen deferred entirely to her husband's wishes. How she would have liked to tour the castle and museums of Europe, enriching her knowledge of history and works of art. Instead, she uncomplainingly endured the yearly tedium of Balmoral. In 1925, it is true, the king, grumbling, agreed to a Mediterranean cruise on the advice of his doctors. The Queen, of course, accompanied him, but so did Princess Victoria, whom she had invited in order to give her a week or two of relief from looking after Queen Alexandra at Sandringham. It proved an unhappy arrangement. Okay, this little difference here reminds me of my parents. My dad was a countryman. He loved hunting, he loved fishing, he loved the country. Whereas my mom, she was a city girl. She loved the city, she loved museums, she loves artwork, she loves literature. But, okay, they made it work. So, and there's going to be differences, of course, but they made it work. The Queen's love of natural beauty and ancient monuments served only to inflame the innate Philistinism of her sister-in-law, who not only subjected her to a torrent of mindless mockery, but also incited the king to join in the cruel sport. "I'm so glad to be back," the Queen wrote on her return home. Shy by nature and unwilling to be thought an intruder on affairs of state, the Queen evolved her own method of rescuing the king from apprehension or perplexity. She would ask Stanforham and some other trusted members of the household to pass her advice as if it were her own. The Queen, however, acted alone in protecting her husband from one hazard. She did not like him to be contradicted at any time, particularly at meals, and especially by women. Any visitor infringing this taboo was discouraged with unexpected ferocity. The infrequency with which the Queen unleashed her temper made its use all the more memorable. She was said to be the only person of whom fearless Nancy Astor stood in awe. Even the landscape had to keep its distance. As the Queen arrived one day to inspect the new gardens at Windsor, a low-hanging branch of an oak gazed through her toque. She gazed severely at the offending limb, but without comment. The Queen was formidable in defense of what was due to the person of the sovereign and to the dignity, almost to the divinity, of kingship. Yet she was not without a sense of humor, however suppressed it may have been during her husband's lifetime. Princess Alice said to her sister in law, "In youth she was gay and amusing, and would often be in fits of laughter. As the queen, she was so sedate, so poised, but after the king's death, she blossomed out once more, and all her great worth was revealed." Queen Mary's humor sometimes found expression in those mildly unkind practical jokes which seemed to afflict royal families all over the world. She cared little for dogs, but when staying with her niece, the Duchess of Beaufort, at Badminton, she did become fond enough of one little animal to enact a ritual each night at the end of dinner. She would ceremoniously give it a dog biscuit. On the evening of the local bishop came to dine, it was him that she delegated the duty, handing him the biscuit with a few words of explanation. But the prelate, rather hard of hearing, thought he was being offered the badminton equivalent of a sheep's eye at a dessert feast. Accepting the mark of favor with misgiving, he munched his way through it to the last crunch. Oh my gosh, he ate a dog biscuit. Other families, amid the shouts of laughter, would at once have explained the mistake. That night, nobody stopped him, and nobody laughed until after his departure. It is not an agreeable story. Yet the Queen could also display a gentler and more whimsical humor that was worn well within the years. When a friend mentioned a certain notorious lady whose successive marriages has obliged her to change her name 7 times, she replied, "Well, I have had to change mine quite a lot. I was Princess May, Duchess of York, Duchess of Cornwall, Princess of Wales, and then the Queen. But whereas mine have been by accident, hers have been by enterprise." Lord Mountbatten used to often speak of the poignant circumstances in which he heard his father's death. Prince Louis of Battenberg had never wholly recovered from his enforced retirement as First Sea Lord in 1914, the victim of a German name and ancestry. But on August the 4th, 1921, the anniversary of the outbreak of war, he was promoted to Admiral of the Fleet in a belated recognition of his services to the Royal Navy. In the following month, his son, who was serving the HMS Repulse, sought his captain's permission to invite Prince Louis, by now created Marquess of Milford Haven, for a short North Sea cruise in the Dreadnought. His spirits restored by those imaginative gestures, the old admiral was put ashore at Invergordon and seen off to London by train. Mountbatten then returned to his ship, and but a day later or two he went on leave to Dunrobin Castle to stay with the Duke and Duchess of Sutherland. Okay, I have been to that Dunrobin Castle. That's in Scotland, and that is a very interesting castle. So it's in the northern part of Scotland. But a day or two later went on to leave to Dunrobin Castle to stay with the Duke and Duchess of Sutherland. Within 24 hours, he heard that his father had died of a heart attack. He broke down and he wept. The Prince of Wales, a fellow guest, came to comfort him. "I envy you a father whom you could love," he said. "If my father had died, we should have felt nothing but relief." There is a Hanoverian flavor about the prince's sympathy. recalling an age when monarchs and their heirs quarreled rancorously behind masks of respect and affection. Yet those traditional estrangements, as much political as personal, offer no key to the tensions between King George V and his eldest son. The Prince of Wales, far from waiting in hungry expectation to inherit the throne, he dreaded the prospect of kingship and its burdensome restraints. Like many others of his generation who had survived the war, he had demanded some measure of freedom from the stiff conventions of his upbringing that his father denied him. A virtuous king, wrote Logan Pearsall Smith, is a king who has shirked his proper function to embody for his subjects an ideal of illustrious misbehavior absolutely beyond their reach. That teasing paradox is not without truth. It helps to explain, for instance, the popularity of King Edward VII. His son, however, preferred to follow the example of Queen Victoria, believing that the survival of the monarchy depended upon the rigid standards of morality and manners, two facets of human behavior to which he attached equal weight. Thus, the differences between an apprehensive king and a willful heir. At least in the immediate post war years, they were conflicts not of principle, but of temperament. Absurd squabbles over the dress and deportment that neither man was prepared to discuss with goodwill or resolve or understanding. The prince was 27 when he spoke of those chilling words of condolence to Mountbatten. Yet still subjected to a parental surveillance that challenged both pride and reason. What made it harder to bear was the universal adulation which greeted his public appearances, partly during a succession of arduous tours that took him to most parts of the empire and beyond. Although endowed with boyish good looks and engaging informality and ready charm, he was handicapped by shyness and uncertain stamina. I have just come back from seeing off the Prince of Wales at Victoria, Curzon wrote in 1920. Crowds of cheering people. In a tight naval uniform which clung close to his figure, he did not look above 15. Quite a pathetic little person. The prince also had to overcome an aversion to foreigners, one of the few beliefs he was able to share with his father. He told his confidant, Lady Coke, "The more I live abroad, and I don't live anywhere else nowadays, the more thankful I am I was born an Englishman." All those embarrassments he surmounted with triumphant, triumphant panache. Lord Reading, who had recently returned from a diplomatic mission to Washington, wrote to Stanfordham, "The prince has proved a better ambassador than all of us rolled in one. He caught the American spirit, so difficult to understand quickly, has done more in America to make their people comprehend the strength of the democratic support to our monarchy than all books and articles and propaganda." A more remarkable tribute came from M. Juzeran, the French ambassador in Washington, who reported to his government. Okay, this is all in French, and I'm going to botch it up, so I'm not even going to say it. Even the king, so sparing with praise of his children, wrote to the prince after his visit to Canada, "I offer you my warmest congratulations on the splendid success of your tour, which is due in great measure to your own personality and the wonderful way in which you played up. It makes me very proud of you, and it makes me feel very happy that my son should be received with such marvelous enthusiasm of loyalty and affection." The euphoria did not last. The Prince of Wales, who was required by both his father and his entourage to behave with circumspection of a proconsul, found much of his overseas itinerary of paralyzing boredom. He showed no sign of taking an interest in the country, its institutions, or its government. The British ambassador in Tokyo reported to London. The prince also made the mistake of not quite realizing that he was in a foreign country, and he seemed to think that he could alter his program just as he pleased, and refused to go on expeditions for which long and expensive preparations have been made. This, from what I understand, is what Prince Edward, then the Prince of Wales, was known for. He would change his schedule on a whim, and I've heard that from different sources. But with an understanding rarely shown by the king, Sir Charles Eliot's letter continues, "I began to sympathize with him, and to feel how dull and monotonous everything appears on a royal tour. Princes must think that red carpets and flags are a kind of vegetation that grows everywhere, like grass and trees." The prince was guilty of endearing indiscretions, too, when he loudly declared at a reception that the governor of Hong Kong and Singapore were fossilized clerks who ought to be kept in a cupboard in Whitehall. He also lapsed from decorum in trying to procure informal companionship at successive stops along the route. The Japanese alone were cooperative. With their usual excess of precaution, Eliot told the Foreign Secretary they subjected every female that could come near him to a medical examination. There was nearly a terrible scandal because two missionary ladies who wished to present him with a Japanese Bible were hurried off by the police on the grounds that they had not been inspected or disinfected. All such improprieties, whether at home or abroad, were either reported directly to the king or reached him by an intelligence network said to include Princess Victoria and Sister Agnes. At one moment, they were considered grave enough to warrant a meeting at Downing Street, attended by Lord George, Stanfordham, the prince himself, and a senior member of his staff. It was made memorable by the Prime Minister's rebuke. "If you are one day to be a constitutional king, you must first be a constitutional Prince of Wales." King George V has passed into history as a heavy-handed father, not because he tried to impress on his son the danger of a scandal-ridden monarchy. Such an apprehension was justified. Where he acted unwisely was in rebuking peccadilloes with a severity that should have been reserved for grave misconduct. At Sandringham one Christmas, the Prince of Wales explained to Lady Wigram the meaning of the fashionable psychological term complex. His own, he confessed, was impatiently shouting instructions to his chauffeur. If a chauffeur had made a wrong turn, it drove him into such a frenzy. As for his father, the prince continued, he had two complexes: a passion for punctuality and a fussiness about clothes. Both the king's preoccupations, they bore heavily on his sons, although no more so than on his courtiers and members of government. Indeed, his acute sense of time left its mark on national life between the wars. When the cabinet produced a report on the observance of 11 November as an annual day of remembrance, The king insisted, as no two watches agree, there must be maroons to mark the beginning and end of the 2-minute silence. Within the royal family, the story is still told of Prince Henry's homecoming after several months abroad. He arrived at the palace just as his father sat down to dine, and he said, "Late as usual, Harry." That was his greeting to Prince Henry. Fearing the certainty of a rebuke, the princes rarely risked a breach of punctuality. But in the cut and color of their clothes, particularly naval or military uniform, lay many a hazard. Even the most successful overseas tour would be punctuated by letters from the king, such as this. From various photographs of you, you have appeared in the papers, and I see that you wear turn-down collars and white uniform, with a collar and a black tie. I wonder whose idea that was, as anything more unsmart than I never saw. I have worn tunics for 20 years in white, which was very smart. As the Duke of York prepared to return home from a similarly arduous tour, his father issued a minute instruction about his uniform. Frock coat and epaulets, without medals and riband, only stars. The king added the last injunction. We will not embrace at the station before so many people. When you kiss Mama, take off your hat. Only one thing was worse than the wrong sort of clothes for an empire tour, and that was no clothes at all. It infuriated the king to see newspaper pictures of the Prince of Wales and Mountbatten cooling off at sea. You and Dick in a swimming pool together is hardly dignified. Though comfortable in a hot climate, you might as well be photographed naked. No doubt about it would please the public more. At home, the princes would stiffen in apprehension before entering their father's presence. One morning at breakfast, the king said to his eldest son, I hear you are not wearing gloves at the ball last night. Please see that this does not happen again. Another day, there was a storm because the Prince's Wales hunting boots had pink tops. When he appeared for the first time in the new style of trousers with turn-ups, the king asked with heavy sarcasm, Is it raining in here? At the age of 30, he was similarly reprimanded in front of guests at Sandringham for coming in to tea in shooting clothes, having been to see a sick dog. He at once left the table and ordered tea in his room. There was an altercation at Balmoral between the king and the prince over the correct way to wear skene-dhu in the stocking. Prince George remarked engagingly to the minister in attendance that he never knew what to do with the knives and forks and other odds and ends demanded by the kilt. One of the Prince of Wales' first acts on becoming the king in 1936 was to abolish wearing of the frock coat at court. But after his abdication a year later, he seemed to find merit in the custom of his father's day. Winston Churchill, invited to dine with the Duke of Windsor in France, found him wearing full Highland dress. He wrote to his wife, when you think you could hardly get him to put on a short coat and black tie when he was Prince of Wales, one now sees the change in the point of view. Which makes me wonder, I wonder if William, the Prince of Wales, will ever wear the Highland dress, the Highland dress with the skirt. You know, he doesn't like to wear that, but I wonder if he'll do it when he becomes king. King George saw in his son's cavalier attitude to dress the symptom of a deeper malaise, an unwillingness to prepare for his eventual role. By the post-war decade, scarcely a shadow of divine right remained to sustain the monarchy. Its survival depended on the aptitudes and the self-discipline of the monarch. It was not necessary, in the king's view, to appease the forces of republicanism, but rather to invoke those of sober, middle-class beliefs that instinctively repel revolution. Little, little in the Prince of Wales' life seemed to reflect such values. Rather, a world of nightclubs and painted fingernails, of equivocal weekends and loose marriage ties. During one empire tour, he was contemptuous of a telegram from his father warning him not to go dancing in Holy Week. Holy Week with a capital H and a capital W, the prince sneered. And then he had to be dissuaded from sending a violent reply. It was also reported to Buckingham Palace that the prince smoked too much and was rather free with alcohol. But the king enjoyed a cigarette and knew of old how rumor could multiply a glass of wine and a thimble of port. The king blamed some of his son's shortcomings on a raffish circle of friends. He particularly mistrusted Captain Edward Metcalfe, popularly known as Fruity, an ebullient cavalryman attached to the prince's entourage during his tour of India, and subsequently an equerry on his personal staff. In November 1924, the king tried to persuade his son to part with Metcalfe, but found him very obstinate. A few months later, he gave orders that Metcalfe was to be posted to India on staff of a new commander-in-chief. Within 2 years, however, he had bounced back and was once more in the prince's service. The Earl of Dudley, an intimate friend of the Prince of Wales from Oxford's days, also felt the king's displeasure when Sir Samuel Hoare, Secretary of State for India, nominated him to be the governor of Madras. Although Dudley was an able man of business who had acquired some knowledge of Indian affairs during his years in the Commons, the king refused to approve the appointment. One way in which Metcalfe made himself unwelcome at court was by encouraging the Prince of Wales to ride in steeplechase. The king often remonstrated with his son for overtaxing his strength with bouts of violent exercise. Now he feared that the prince, a courageous but unskilled horseman, was endangering the succession of the throne. He told Queen Alexandra in 1924. Yesterday, David had a fall riding it in a point-to-point race near Aldershot, and he bruised and cut his face a little and got a slight concussion. But it's nothing serious. It is too bad that he should continue to ride in these steeplechases. I have asked him not to on many occasions. Everyone thinks it's a great mistake, and he has run unnecessary risks. Sounds a lot like Prince William in flying the helicopters. They tell him time and time again not to fly the helicopters with Prince George. But I think he's finally acquiesced a little bit. Now that George is 12, about to turn 13. The prince's equestrianism displeased his father in other ways. "Why doesn't my son ride like a gentleman?" the king asked Metcalfe on observing the prince. With courtier's presence of mind, Metcalfe replied, "Because he does not have your majesty's hands." The prince took an unkind revenge. shooting with his father at Sandringham in the year of his tumble near Aldershot, and having missed several birds, he put down his gun and called out, "I think this is an old woman's game." What most haunted the king and queen was their elder son's refusal to marry. Instead, he remained in his small bachelor quarters in St. James's Palace, solaced by a succession of married women. Only once was his name linked to that of an unmarried girl, Lady Rosemary Levinson Gower, the young daughter of the Duke of Sutherland. But it was never serious of a romance. In 1919, she married the prince's friend, Lord Dudley. The first of those married women with whom he fell in love with was Lady Cope, the confidant of his unhappy years in the army. "You have been too angelically kind to me for words," he told her in 1917, "and have absolutely changed my life." A few weeks later, a chance encounter with Mrs. William Dudley Ward, the wife of a Liberal MP, began a liaison that lasted for the next 16 years. During that long attachment, other women flitted in and out of his life, but none could match Frida Dudley Ward, in sweetness and in nature or generosity of heart. Until the prince fell in love with Mrs. Simpson, she was his wife in all but name. Such domestic fidelity brought no satisfaction to the king. He wanted to see the prince married, installed in Marlborough House, and raising the next generation of a royal family. In private, he would refer disparagingly to his son's mistress as the lace maker's daughter, or the South American whore, as if both vocations carried much of the same sort of stigma. Yet he did not understand that strain of melancholy in his son's character, which not even Frida Dudley Ward's love could entirely exorcise. In 1930, he agreed to the prince's request to restore Fort Belvedere, which was near Windsor, as a country retreat. He said, "What could you possibly want with that queer old place?" the king inquired. "Those damn weekends, I suppose." Then he smiled. "Well, if you want it, you can have it." As the prince wrote of his Toy Town castle, "Soon I came to love it, as I loved no other material thing." From time to time, the king would plead with his son to put his life in order, both for his own sake and for that of the monarchy. An account of one such conversation given by the king to a friend begins with a significant disclaimer. The king assured the prince that he did not intend to have a row with him, which suggests that their previous discussions had been less harmonious. He went on to say that although the prince was now at the zenith of his popularity, the public would one day learn of his double life and recoil from it with the vigor of the nonconformist conscience. It was true, the king continued, that all young men sowed their wild oats. But wasn't the prince at 38 rather beyond that age? He felt sure that his son was not at heart happy, and never would be until he settled down. And had he considered how lost and lonely he would feel as a bachelor king living on his own in Buckingham Palace? The prince replied that he resented the way in which scandal-mongers told tales to the king about his private life, and that he believed the nation had grown more tolerant in judging moral issues. Above all, he confessed that the thought of marrying a foreign princess was distasteful to him. Yet he understood that the king would not wish him to marry a commoner. On this point, the king explained that times have changed and that he would be prepared to consider a suitable, well-born English girl. It was, the prince replied, the first time that this had ever been suggested to him. That note of surprise on the part of the prince is disingenuous. After the Privy Council meeting in 1917, which established the House of Windsor and renounced the German titles, the king wrote, I also inform the council that May and I have decided some time ago that our children would be allowed to marry into British families. It was quite a historical occasion. Okay. This is an important point. When he changed the House of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha to the House of Windsor, and took away the prince titles, he also opened up marriages of the royals to marry commoners, which paved the way for his son Bertie to marry Lady Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon. And of course, we know that history and where that went. But that's a very important point to remember. It opened up royal marriages to commoners or less royal status. So, since then, the king had given permission for Prince Mary to marry Viscount Lascelles and for the Duke of York to marry Lady Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon. Had the Prince of Wales produced a bride of similar background, there is no reason to believe that the king would have withheld his consent. The prince failed to confide in his father not because he loved were lacking in royal blood, but because there were one and all married women, and the most seismic of his romances was yet to come. As the scandalmongers feasted on the prince's reputation, the king grieved both for a wayward child and a threatened monarchy, but few suspected the burden he bore. Like Stevenson's Ware of Hermiston, another father who lost his son's friendship and even his son's toleration, and on he went up the great bare staircase of his duty. The relationship between the king and his younger sons was scarcely less astringent. He believed that happiness lay only in the settlement of family life. And until they married, he was ever on his guard against unsuitable attachments and other more trivial failings. So much censure leavened by so little praise undermined their confidence. It cannot have been by chance that every one of his children was in some degree afflicted by nervous strain. Prince Albert suffered least from paternal reproof. In him, the king recognized many of his own virtues. He was industrious. He had sobriety, domesticity, the simple Christian faith of a sailor, courage in surmounting ill health, and a frustrating stammer. They shared the same absorbed interest in the countryside and in shooting and in clothes. They wrote in almost identical hands. Yet it was an unequal partnership marked by the deference of a son for his father and of a subject for his sovereign. The king acknowledged that imbalance in a letter in 1923 to his son, by then now the Duke of York. You have always been so sensible and so easy to work with, and you've always been ready to listen to any advice and to agree with my opinion about people and things. And I feel that we have always got on very well together, and it is very different to our dear David. Yet not even the most submissive of sons could avoid a niggling rebuke across thousands of miles. On the strength of a newspaper photograph taken during the Duke's tour of New Zealand, the king wrote accusing him of inattention when inspecting a guard of honor. The blame is not without the princes accustomed to ceremonial for the past 20 years, but with a distorting lens of the camera. That same year, Prince Henry, a dedicated cavalry officer of 27, found this letter awaiting him on his return from a canceled army maneuvers. King George wrote to Prince Henry, I can't understand how you got leave and therefore missed the ride home. I should have thought that you would have remained with your men and shown thereby that you wished to share their discomfort. At least I should have done so if I'd have been your age. But no doubt times have changed since my young days. Okay, just a couple pages left. To shirk either duty or discomfort, it would have been wholly out of character in Prince Henry, whose only ambition during those years between the war was to command his regiment free from encumbrance of royal protocol. An engaging charm protected Prince George, the youngest and most handsome of the king's surviving sons, from the consequences of occasional folly. When the storm clouds blew up at Buckingham Palace or Sandringham, he could depend on the sympathy, if not intervention, of his mother. Alone of her children, he had the historical and aesthetic curiosity to discuss with her all those works of art with which other royal eyes seemed scarcely to exist. Emotionally as rigid as the buckram on which rested her poire of diamonds and garter star, she would soften into affection at the thought of him. Be an angel, she began unexpectedly in a note to her husband's equerry, and find out for me from the Admiralty whether any ship is likely to go to Malta before Christmas, as I have 2 or 3 largest parcels for Prince George. If the conduct of the boys remained almost wholly the king's preserve, the upbringing and the welfare of Princess Mary was conceded to her mother. As early as 1912, the Queen had conceived an imaginative marriage for her only daughter. Then, age 15, she would be betrothed to Ernest August of Hanover, heir to the Duke of Brunswick. As the only descendant in the male line of King George III, he would reunite what Queen Mary called the old royal family, to which she belonged through her mother, to her husband's dynasty of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, soon to be renamed the House of Windsor. Although Ernest August's kingdom of Hanover had been annexed to Prussia in 1866, the young prince was nevertheless an eligible suitor. He will have a great fortune, the Queen told Mensdorff at Windsor in the summer of 1912, and could be in England quite a lot. She added that she would prefer such a husband for her daughter to the heir to a small country like Greece, Romania, or Bulgaria. Her plan came to nothing. Less than a year later, Ernest August married the only daughter of the German emperor. The war put an end to such dynastic matchmaking, and it was not until almost a decade later that Princess Mary was married to a Yorkshire landowner 15 years her senior, Viscount Lascelles, heir to the Earl of Harewood. Even before succeeding to the family estates, he inherited a fortune of several million pounds from his eccentric great-uncle, Lord Clanlacard. The king shared his son-in-law's interest in racing, the queen his knowledge of pictures and furniture. Being my only daughter, the king wrote, I confess that I dread the idea of losing her, but thank God she will live in England. He offered the family a marquisate, but they preferred to remain earls. Marquisettes, they believed, died out more quickly. In 1932, however, he took much delight in creating his daughter the Princess Royale. The Queen, in particular, enjoyed her regular visits to Harwood, from which she would sally out to visit other country houses and pillage the well-stocked antique shops of Harrogate. With the departure of the Princess Mary to the north of England, her parents longed increasingly for daughters-in-law whom they could welcome into the family circle. These hopes were only partly satisfied. The Prince of Wales did not marry in his father's lifetime. Prince George delayed until 1934, and Prince Henry until 1935. The Duke of York, however, always more dependable than his brothers, made a memorable, successful choice. In January 1923, he was betrothed to Lady Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, the youngest daughter of the 14th Earl of Strathmore. Okay. I think I read somewhere that royals don't, especially back then, they don't get engaged, they get betrothed. So that was a common word used then. So Albert was betrothed to Elizabeth. The king, easily cast down by the world's troubles, wrote in a reply to a letter of congratulations. I think the French are playing the very devil. State of Ireland, awful. Begin to doubt whether Lucerne will succeed in producing peace. Baldwin's mission to Washington about debt will fail, I fear. So things look black everywhere. This event is the only gleam of sunshine. Chip Shannon, with his inspired talent for popping up at the center of events, had a few days earlier found himself a fellow guest of Lady Elizabeth at Lord Gage's house in Sussex. He noted her reaction to an embarrassing rumor. The evening papers have announced her engagement to the Prince of Wales, so we all bowed and bobbed and teased her, calling her ma'am. I am not sure that she enjoyed it. It couldn't be true, but how delighted everyone would be. She certainly has something on her mind. She is more gentle, loving, and exquisite than any woman alive. But this evening I thought her unhappy. I longed to tell her I would die for her, although I am not in love with her. Poor Gage is desperately fond of her. In vain, but he is far too heavy to tutor and Squire Arkle for so rare and patrician a creature as Elizabeth. Then came the official news of her betrothal, not to the Prince of Wales, but to the Duke of York. Shannon's diary continues, I was so startled and almost fell out of my bed when I read the court circular. We have all hoped and waited for so long for this romance to prosper that we had begun to despair, and we should ever accept him. He has been the most ardent of wooers, and was apparently at St. Paul's, Walden, on Sunday, when he at last proposed to her. He motored at once to Sandringham, and the announcement is the result. the royalties allowing her no time to change her mind. He is the luckiest of men, and there is not a man in England today that doesn't envy him. The clubs are in gloom. Another chronicler, Mr. Asquith, was bidden to inspect the wedding's present day or two before the marriage ceremony at Westminster Abbey. As always, when describing royal occasions, he wrote with a sneer, "I went in my knee breeches and medals after dinner to Buckingham Palace, where the rooms, big as they were very nearly crowded. There were huge glass cases like you see in the on Bond Street, shops filled with jewels and every kind of gilt and silverware. Not a thing did I see that I would have cared to have or give. The poor little bride," everyone says in full charm, and stood in a row with the king and the queen and the bridegroom and was completely overshadowed. It must have been the very last time Lady Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon was overshadowed, whether as the Duke of York, the Queen Consort, or Queen Mother. The king adored her at sight. "The better I know, the more I see of your dear little wife," he wrote to Bertie from Balmoral soon after the marriage. "The more charming I think she is, and everyone fell in love with her." The family marveled at the king's response when she appeared slightly late for a meal and apologized. "I think," he said, "we must have sat down 2 minutes early today." Oh, and you know how punctual he is about his time. For her part, the young Duchess found him angelic, and she wrote of the king after his death, "I miss him dreadfully. Unlike his own children, I was never afraid of him, and in all the 12 years of having me as a daughter-in-law, he never spoke of one unkind or abrupt word to me, and was always ready to listen and give advice on his own silly little affairs. He was so kind and dependable, and when he was in the mood, he could be deliciously funny, too." The serenity and sweet temper which she brought to the royal house have endured unbroken for 60 years, yet those qualities alone would not have protected her from the buffets of fortune in peace and war, which descended from kings of Scotland. She was descended from kings of Scotland. She could also boast of one of those rambunctious family histories punctuated by brawls and battles, rebellion and imprisonment, and a heritage of robust self-confidence that was to sustain not only her marriage, but the monarchy itself. So and that ended up to be another marriage where their virtues and their character traits complemented each other. The same way George V and Mary complemented each other, I think George VI and Queen Elizabeth also complemented each other. So, and the same actually went on for Prince Philip and Queen Elizabeth. They complemented each other. And we see that actually in Charles and Camilla, and I see it in William and Catherine. And that's how all marriages are. You just complement each other and you support each other and give each other strength. But I'm going to read in a separate section the last section of chapter 8 on the home life. And that section is entitled Sports and Pastimes. So that's a separate episode, and we will read that in my next episode. And then I hope to finish that today, and then we can go on to chapter 9. So Thank you very much for listening, and you have a nice day.